Hello everyone, this is my case study for EDL 851 Module 13. Just to give you a little summary of what we were to read in the case study, the school is Crestview. It's in a rural community, but there are 3 elementary schools and there's a pretty strong community and parent involvement. Our principal is Jean Wilson, and she's new to the district, but she's not new to education. She's been teaching for 13 years and has been working hard to get her administrative license. The school community is strong and solid. Mrs. Wilson doesn't want to rock the boat in her first year as being an administrator. And by the time 3rd year rolls around, she's starting to notice that one of her teachers who generally does really well and has been teacher of the year, Mrs. Hortons, has been experiencing some hardships at home and her personality is changing. Mrs. Horton is starting to kind of challenge the academic community. She's not willing to work with others and collaborate on the changes that Mrs. Wilson would like in the school. And parents are starting to complain about Mrs. Horton's teaching, and students are becoming afraid of the classroom. And Mrs. Wilson and superintendent and school board are now involved, and parents are wanting their children pulled out of the classroom. And the end of the case study has Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Horton and a parent sitting down and having a hostile meeting. So what we know. We know that Mrs. Horton has a lot of teaching experience. We know that Mrs. Wilson has a lot of teaching experience. So we have very knowledgeable and qualified people. We know that Mrs. Wilson has observed Mrs. Horton's classroom and has not observed any sort of challenges from what she says. Mrs. Horton is also unwilling to take on new programs and change her teaching. We also know that parents and students are angry and upset. What do we need to know? We need to know kind of the conversation that is going on between Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Horton. That's been talked about in the case, but we need to really understand what the two are saying. This is obviously something that may not happen, but we also might need Mrs. Horton to open up and express the challenges that she's facing in ways that Mrs. Wilson could support her. We also need to know kind of the documented what's going on in the classroom. Why is Mrs. Horton showing up late? So Mrs. Wilson just needs to do a better job of observation. And then there just needs to be more meetings with principal, teacher, and parents. And so this is the problem. The problem is that Mrs. Horton has kind of lost classroom instruction. Her students aren't going to respect her. Some are going to fear her. The home is going to influence the students' perception of Mrs. Horton. So the community is going to start to pull their students from the classroom. Mrs. Wilson is going to start to lose respect from the community. Teachers will become frustrated with having to work with Mrs. Horton and work in a community that has a hostile teacher. And then that's just going to impact students' behavior because Mrs. Wilson's going to just constantly have to focus on Mrs. Horton's classroom. So some strategies that I think could help alleviate this problem. First, I would say that Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Horton need to sit down and have a pre-conference. They need to sit down and meet one-on-one, and they need to discuss the problem. They need to discuss challenges facing the school, why Mrs. Wilson would like to go in a different direction with the building, and just open up the dialogue where both can talk. And then they also need to discuss that Mrs. Wilson will be conducting observations. Some strategies that I would suggest that are used in this scenario. First, I would say that before they meet, they each need to write down a plan on how they're going to set up and help support the school community. They also need to openly discuss the parents and their concern with the students in the classroom. Mrs. Wilson needs to not be afraid to express openly how parents feel about Mrs. Horton. And this needs to be the time where Mrs. Horton feels comfortable with opening up about the challenges in her own life and how her teaching has kind of evolved. The second step, I would say, to solving this problem would be that Mrs. Wilson just needs to conduct more classroom observations, whether those are planned or just walkthroughs. But there needs to be more observation on Mrs. Horton's classroom. I also think that some other people need to observe Mrs. Horton's classroom. So other administrators from other elementary schools, school board, the superintendent, other people need to be getting into that classroom. I'd also say that to kind of help with Mrs. Horton and the other teachers, we need to have some in-service days to, one, talk about observations and walkthroughs, but also any sort of new initiatives, reading and all of that, and time to work through that. So strategies, I would say that Mrs. Wilson needs to debrief with Mrs. Horton after each observation, just to, whether that's the walkthrough or the planned, and also needs to every time provide written feedback of the observation and give faculty members time and the ability to collaborate with one another to kind of avoid some of these frustrations that are starting. Third step, I would say that Mrs. Wilson needs to rock the boat. I know that she's afraid of making people upset and the idea that this school has it all together so that there doesn't need to be any changes, but she needs to be innovative and push her staff to continue to want to be learners and educate students. I would say that they also need to provide support and structure for all of the teachers, not just trying to help Mrs. Horton, but try and figure out how all the teachers in the building can come together and work together. And then I would also say, just so that way Mrs. Horton's not the only one meeting with parents, I would also establish where Mrs. Wilson probably needs to make it a norm that she and parents and teachers sit down and discuss challenges that are facing the school. And then last, I would say that there needs to be some sort of line of support with documentation for those students or for those teachers who are struggling to make accommodations for the school. And some strategies here, I would say we need to establish a mission or vision for the school that everyone can adhere to, create well-structured meetings with parents and teachers, and establish improvement plans for struggling teachers. So the resolution. My thought is that we need to promote the success and well-being of every student. I think it is inappropriate to just go off of and kind of establish these ideas because parents are complaining about Mrs. Horton. There needs to be more information. So that means that observation and collaboration need to be documented. There's just not enough data to back up all of these allegations made by the parents. So I would encourage Mrs. Horton to open up and ask for support. And then I would also say that at this time, this plan would allow for Mrs. Horton to grow as an educator, and then it would allow Mrs. Wilson to practice some leadership and create more of a community in her school. So what do I think? I think that Mrs. Wilson needs to stand firm on her knowledge. She knows what she's doing. She's educated. She's been in the system a long time. She just needs to stand firm. She needs to do what's best for the students. She needs to make sure that when she's meeting with parents and students that they're not meeting in small chairs, but they're meeting in a room for adults, and document every interaction. And again, don't be afraid to rock the boat. I feel frustrated that Mrs. Wilson lacks this leadership and this ability to kind of motivate everyone in the building. I'm also concerned for students in their education. They can't focus in a room when they're getting yelled at or afraid of the teacher or willing and want to move rooms and not be with the teacher that has been assigned to them. But at the same time, I also feel empathetic for Mrs. Horton's personal life, and I can understand where some of her frustration is with all of the change happening in her personal life. She doesn't want school to change, so that conversation needs to continue. But at the end of the day, what I value the most is I want to protect the children's education and social and emotional growth. I also want to be accurate and fair with all of my teachers' evaluations. I want to create a strong academic community, and I want my staff to collaborate and help foster that growth in the children at the school. So things that are still unresolved, documented interaction between teacher and students, information that Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Horton discussed, the understanding for not wanting, like why does Mrs. Horton not want the new program? What problems does she have with it? And just the lack of building rapport with every teacher. So what I would do for some academic success. So again, I would make sure that my observations are documented and that I am in every classroom and I'm doing a fair evaluation of every teacher. I would create some accountability in my structured professional development for the struggling teachers. And I would also make sure that there's accountability for both professional development and for struggling teachers by putting them on a professional learning plan to kind of fill some gaps. I would ensure that students' well-beings are being met by encouraging students and teachers to both visit counselors. I would say that Mrs. Horton kind of could use some therapy and maybe be able to talk out some of this negativity that she's harboring. So that could help with her classroom. I would also create a professional environment for both parents and teachers. This would just allow everyone to be able to speak freely, which then would open up this negativity, which would then not reflect on students. And then I would provide resources and time for teachers, so that ensures that students are receiving the best education and the best personality of the teacher. And then how I would, as a school leader, enhance instructional capacity, professional development. I feel like she doesn't want to rock the boat at the school, and this would give the opportunity for teachers to develop their changes and grow professionally. I would also say that leadership, so being present and visible in the classroom on a regular basis, would help support this idea. And then just being willing to have those tough conversations with teachers who aren't meeting the vision and are unwilling to collaborate with others, and putting them on a plan for success or having those tough conversations. So that's my analysis of the case study. Thank you very much.